Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over Part 3, Chapter 2 of George Orwell's classic, 1984. Alright, so we've seen where Winston is being held in the jail cell. Is he going to be next? Let's see, shall we? This chapter starts off with Winston strapped down to a cot-like bed that was lifted off of the ground. He says that strong light was falling onto his face. O'Brien was standing at one side, and to another side, a man in a white coat holding a hypodermic needle was standing at the other end. He says that even after his eyes were open, it took him a little while to gradually see the surroundings all around him. He then tells the reader what happened before he was on this bed. He says that they had come in and hit him on the arm, and that was only the preliminary to what was about to come. He says that this was the first bit of brutality and torture that he was about to experience. He said that at all times there were 5 or 6 men in black uniforms surrounding him. He said sometimes it was fists or truncheon or steel rods or boots, or even when he was rolling on the ground like an animal, writhing in pain, they always beat him. They kicked him or hit him on every square inch of his body. He said that the worst part with all the cruelty and wickedness and unforgivable things was that his body would not let him lose consciousness. He said after all of this torture, a minor sleight of fist drawn back was enough to make him pour forth the confession of real and imaginary crimes. At some point, he tried to resolve of confessing nothing, stating, "I will not confess, but yet I must hold out till the pain becomes unbearable." They then went into beating him again, and as he was being beaten, they threw him around like a sack of potatoes on the stone floor. They would let him recuperate for a few hours and then go back to the cell to beat him up. He says that he also remembered a surly barber arriving to scrape his chin and to crop his hair. Unsympathetic men in white coats, feeling his pulse, tapping his reflexes, turning his eyelids, and running harsh fingers over his arms and body to search for broken bones. And they were also shooting needles into his arms that made him fall asleep. After the physical brutality came the mental torture. This was what he found the most horrific. He said it was party member men who were little round creatures with flashing spectacles that would slap him in the face, wring his ears, pull his hair, and make him stand on one leg, refusing to let him pee, and would shine glaring lights into his face until his eyes ran with tears, all to humiliate him and destroy his power of arguing and reasoning. They would mercilessly question him hour after hour after hour, trying to trip him up, laying traps for him, and twisting everything he said into convincing him at every step of the way that he was lying and contradicting himself, until he began weeping as much for shame as from nervous fatigue. Winston says that because of all of this and the threats of physical torture again, he confessed to things that he did and did not do, from assassinations of intimate party members, to the distribution of seditious pamphlets, to embezzling in public funds, to sales of military secrets, to sabotage. He confessed to even being an East Asian government spy as far back as 1968. He confessed to being a religious believer, an admirer of capitalism, and a sexual pervert. He also confessed that he had murdered his wife, although he knew that the questionnaires must have known that his wife was alive and well. He also confesses to being in personal touch with Goldstein and had been a member of the underground organization along with every other human being he'd ever known. He did all of this because it was easier to just convict everybody, because in the eyes of the party, there was no distinction between thought and deed. Winston is trying to take in his surroundings as he's strapped into this chair. As he's looking around, he can see a man in a white coat who is readying dials above him. The door clangs open and a wax-faced man, officer, steps in, followed by 2 guards. "Room 101, says the officer. The man in the white coat did not turn around. He did not look at Winston either. He was only looking at the dials. Winston gets the feeling that O'Brien is standing just at his elbow, just out of sight. Winston also believes that it was O'Brien who was directing everything, from the guards beating him up, to letting him rest, to preventing the guards from killing him, that O'Brien was the one who decided when Winston would scream in pain and when he would have a respite, when he should be fed, when he should sleep, when the drugs were pumped into his arms. He says that it was O'Brien who asked the questions and suggested the answers. He was the tormentor and he was the protector. He was the inquisitor and he was the friend. He says he can't remember if it was the drugs that put him to sleep or in normal sleep, that he hears a voice murmuring, "Don't worry, Winston, you are in my keep for 7 years. I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come. I shall save you. I shall make you perfect." He was not sure whether it was O'Brien's voice, but it was the same voice that had said to him, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." That dream that he had 7 years ago. Winston says he doesn't know when the interrogation was over. He said there was a period of blackness, and the cellar room in which he was in now had gradually materialized around him. He was almost flat on his back, and he was unable to move. His body was held down at every single point, including his head. O'Brien was looking down at him, and Winston tells the reader how old O'Brien now looks, having a good look at him. O'Brien says, "I told you that if we meet again, it would be here." And Winston says yes. At that moment, without any warning, a wave of pain floods Winston's body. It's so strong that it feels like his spine is about to snap. He says what makes this even more scary is the fact that he has no idea where it's coming from because he can't see the pain being inflicted onto him. O'Brien says that you are afraid because in another moment, something is going to break. You're especially worried that it'll be your backbone. O'Brien says that you have a vivid mental picture of the vertebrae snapping apart and spinal fluids stripping out of them. And that's what you're thinking about. Is it not, Winston? Winston does not answer him, and O'Brien drew back the lever of the dial and the pain receded almost as quickly as it had come. O'Brien tells Winston that that was a 40, and you can see the numbers on the dial right up to 100. O'Brien reminds him that throughout this conversation, he had the power to inflict pain on him at any moment, and do whatever O'Brien chooses. O'Brien says if you tell any lies or attempt to profit in any way or fall below his usual level of intelligence, he will cry out in pain instantly. But he was going to ask if Winston understands, and Winston says yes. Then O'Brien changes his tone to something a little gentler. O'Brien says that he's taking trouble with Winston because he's worth the trouble, and that he knows perfectly well what's the matter with him, and that he's known it for years, though he fought against the knowledge. O'Brien tells Winston that he is mentally deranged and suffers from a defective memory. Then, O'Brien begins a line of questioning. O'Brien first asks, which power is Oceania at war with? To which Winston says that when he was arrested, Oceania was at war with East Asia. O'Brien asks, has Oceania always been at war with East Asia? Winston is quiet for just a little bit as he's gathering his thoughts. To which O'Brien says, the truth please, Winston. Your truth. Tell me what you think, what you remember. Winston states that until only a week before he was arrested, they were not in war with East Asia, and they were in alliance with them. The war was against Eurasia, and it had lasted for 4 years previously. O'Brien stops him and says, another example. Some years ago, you had a very serious delusion indeed, and believed that 3 men, 3 one-time party members named Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford were executed for their treachery and sabotage after making 4 confessions, and that they were not guilty of their crimes that they were charged with. O'Brien says you believe that you had seen unmistakable documentary proof providing that their confessions were false, and that there was a photograph which you had a hallucination about and believed it actually held it in your hands. O'Brien asks if it was a photograph something like this, and in the flash of an instant that same photograph appeared in O'Brien's hand, and Winston saw it only for a second before it disappeared. Winston says it exists, to which O'Brien says no, and he steps across the room and throws it into the memory hole on the opposite wall. O'Brien says that there is a party slogan dealing with control of the past, and he asks Winston to repeat it for him. Winston says, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. O'Brien nods in approval and asks if the past really existed. Winston, not knowing how to answer this, flutters his eyes towards the dial. O'Brien then rephrases his question and says, until this moment, you've never considered what it is meant by existent. Does the past exist concretely in space? Is there something or other, a place, a world of solid objects where the past is still happening? To which Winston replies with no. O'Brien then asks, then where does the past exist, if at all? Winston responds, in records. It is written down, and also in human memories in the mind. O'Brien says, very well then, we the party control all records, and we control our memories. Then we control the past, do we not? Winston asks, but how can you stop people remembering things? Is it involuntary? Is it outside of oneself? How can you control memory? You've not controlled mine. O'Brien goes to put his hand on the dial once more. O'Brien responds with, on the contrary, you have not controlled it. That is what we brought you in here for. You are here because you have failed in humility and self-discipline. O'Brien states that he would not make the act of submission, which is the price of sanity, and Winston preferred to be a lunatic of minority, of one. O'Brien says only the disciplined can see reality. O'Brien goes on to say that whenever the party holds the truth, it is truth, and that it's impossible to see reality except by looking through the eyes of the party. It needs an active self-destruction and effort of the will, and that Winston must humble himself before he can become sane again. O'Brien pauses for a moment and asks, do you remember writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say 2 + 2 makes 4? Winston answers and says, yes. O'Brien holds up his left hand and it's back towards Winston, with the thumb hidden and 4 fingers extended. O'Brien asks, how many fingers am I holding up, Winston? 4. Winston says. And if the party says that it is not 4 but 5, then how many? 4, responds Winston. At that moment, the needle of the dial shot up to 55 and sweat began to spring out of Winston's body. He asks again, Winston, how many fingers? Winston responds 4, the needle goes up to 60. O'Brien then asks again, how many fingers? And Winston yells out, 4. What else can I say? 4. O'Brien asks again, how many times? how many fingers? To which Winston responds with 4. Finally, after asking one more time, Winston says 5. Oberyn responds, "No, Winston, that is no use. You are lying. Do you still think there are 4? How many fingers, please?" Winston responds, 4 or 5, anything you want, only stop the pain. Oberyn turns the machine off and the pain goes away. Winston falls out of consciousness for a few seconds and wakes up with Oberyn's arms wrapped around him. Winston is chattering from the cold that's filling his body. Oberyn tells him that he's a slow learner, and Winston asks how he can help. Oberyn says that sometimes 2 plus 2 is 5. Sometimes it's 3. Sometimes they're all at once. And he says that he must try harder. It's not easy to become sane. Oberyn goes back over to the levers and switches it on once again. Winston thinks that the needle must be set to 70 or 75 at this point. All the time, the unbearable pain was striking through his body. Oberyn had his forefingers still up, asked how many fingers are there. Oberyn then turns the machine off and asks again, how many fingers were there? Winston responds, 4. I suppose there are 4. I could see 5 if I could. I'm still trying to see 5. Oberyn asks, which do you wish to persuade me with? That you see 5? Or that you really see 5 of them? To which Winston says that he really sees them. Oberyn goes back to the machine, and Winston believes the needle is now set at 80 or 90 on the pain scale. Winston mentions the inexcusable pain eating throughout his body, and that a short time later, the pain died down again. When he opened his eyes, he's able to find that he was still saying the same thing about the fingers. After that, Oberyn asks again, how many fingers am I holding up? Winston in response says, I don't know. You will kill me if you do that again. Winston says 4, 5, 6, in all honesty, I don't know. To which Oberyn responds, better. At that moment, a needle slides into Winston's arm and a warm, blissful feeling spreads across his body. The pain was already half forgotten. At this point, Winston knows that Oberyn drove him almost to the brink of insanity, and that he was now having warm feelings towards Oberyn because Oberyn had stopped the pain from happening. Oberyn asks, do you know where you are? Winston responds, the Ministry of Love. Oberyn asks, do you know how long you've been here? To which Winston responds that he doesn't. It could have been days, weeks, or months, he thinks. He thinks it's probably been months. Oberyn asks, and why do you imagine we bring people to this place? To which Winston says, to make them confess. Oberyn says, no, that is not the reason. Try again, Winston. And Winston says, to punish them. Oberyn then flies off the handle and gets very upset, exclaiming, no, not merely to extract confessions or punishment. He states they bring people here to cure them, and that the party is not interested in the stupid crimes one has committed. He says they do not merely destroy their enemies, they change them. Oberyn then goes into a speech about how there are no martyrdoms, and how the biggest problem with the Inquisition of the Middle Ages was that it was a failure due to the fact that when they tried to eradicate heresy, it ended by perpetrating it, and that every heretic that got burned at the stake, thousands of others rose up against it. And the reason for that is because the Inquisition killed its enemies in the open, and killed them while they were still unrepentive, due to the fact that men would die because they would not abandon their true beliefs at all. The glory at that point then belonged to the victim, and all the shame on the Inquisition. Oberyn then goes on to saying that the same thing happened with the Nazis and the Communists, and that all the people who ended up killing would confess to crimes they did not do. The people who saw this knew it wasn't true, and knew that people who were confessing were only doing it to please the punishers. So when these people died, they still became martyrs, and the people who were punishing them, the enemies. Oberyn states, however, that with the party, everything that has happened in the past or in the future will be eradicated about this person, so they will not become martyrs after they die. At the sound of this, Winston then thinks, then why are you torturing me? Why bother with it? As he's thinking this, Oberyn actually stops in his tracks and says that Winston is thinking, why do we destroy you so utterly if they can destroy everything in the past and present? He then asks, is that what you think we're doing, Winston? And Winston says yes. Oberyn states that the difference between the Dark Ages and the Nazis and the Communists and the party is that the party reshapes the mind, that there are no thoughts that can be thunk negatively towards them. He even states the command of the old was thou shalt not. The command of the Taurens was thou shalt. But the party's command is thou art. He says no one whom they bring to this place ever stands out against them. Everyone is washed clean. Oberyn goes on to mention the 3 men, Jones, Arison, and Rutherford, and how they were able to be broken down. Oberyn even mentioned that he was there, and he was the one who helped break them down and turn them towards the party. Winston couldn't help but think that Oberyn was crazy, truly and fully crazy. Oberyn then tells Winston that even if they let him live, he would still never escape from them. What happens in this place happens to him forever. Oberyn says says that never again will he be able to be capable of ordinary human feelings, of love or friendship or joy or living or laughing or curiosity or courage or even integrity. That Winston will always feel hollow. Oberyn will make sure they squeeze him empty and fill him up with the party. At that moment, Oberyn motions for the guy in the white coat to come over there, and 2 soft pads were clamped against Winston's temples. Oberyn says 3,000 to the man in the white coat. All of a sudden, there was a devastating explosion, or what seemed like an explosion, and a blinding flash. A horrific pain flattened him out, and something happened inside of his head. As he was regaining focus, he could still make out the room and recognize the faces that was gazing into his own. Oberyn states that it will not last long and to look him in the eyes. Oberyn then asks, what country is Oceania at war with? Winston says he doesn't remember. Oberyn says, Oceania, East Asia, or Eurasia? Do you remember now? And Winston responds with yes. Oberyn then goes through a series of questions to which Winston responds yes to all of them. One of the questions being about the 3 men and that it was a legend that he had made up. Another question being about the fingers being 5, and Winston responds yes. Winston says that everything went back to normal and the old fears and the hatred came crowding back to him. Winston says to the reader there was a moment, he didn't know how long, maybe it was 30 seconds, that would eat your suggestion of a brain and had it filled up with a patch of emptiness and become an absolute truth. Oberyn stands up with a satisfied air to him. Oberyn motions for the guy in the white coat and he draws back the plunger of a syringe. He then tells Winston that before they end the session, he can ask him a few questions, if he would like. Winston asks, anything? And his eyes immediately go up to the dial. Oberyn says it's switched off, and was that his first question? Winston asks, what have they done with Julia? To which Oberyn smiles and says that she betrayed Winston almost instantly. He says that with all her rebelliousness and deceit and folly and dirty-mindedness, everything had been burned out of her, and it was almost a perfect conversion. Winston says you tortured her, and Oberyn left this unanswered. Next, Winston asks, does Big Brother exist? To which Oberyn says, of course he does. The party exists. Big Brother is the embodiment of the party. Winston asks, does he exist in the same way that I exist? To which Oberyn says, you do not exist. Winston says, I think I exist as I am conscious of my own identity. I was born and I shall die. I have arms and I have legs. I occupy a particular point in space. No other solid object can occupy the same point simultaneously, and in that sense, does Big Brother exist? Oberyn says it is of no importance. He exists. Winston then asks, will Big Brother ever die? To which Oberyn says, of course not. How could he die? Winston then asks, does the Brotherhood exist? To which Oberyn states that, Winston, you will never know that. If we choose to set you free, we have finished with you. And if you live to be 90 years old, still you will never learn whether the answer to that question is yes or no. He says there will be an unsolved riddle in his mind. The last question that was not asked is actually the first one that popped into his mind, but he was too afraid to say it. But at almost an instant, he blurts out, what is in room 101? To which Oberyn says, you know what's in room 101, Winston. Everyone knows what's in room 101. And Oberyn raises a finger to the man in the white coat, and the session was at an end. A needle was directed into Winston's arm, and he sank almost instantly into a deep sleep. This is where Chapter 2 of Part 3 ends. Join us for the next episode as we go over Chapter 3. Have a great rest of your day. If you liked this video, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful one, and as always, stay lit.